I have a woefully undersubscribed subreddit. So please do me a favour, if you're a Redditor, head on over to r/postmortem studios and talk about anything related to any of my shenanigans. Peace. So I've been asked, not unreasonably, I think, why it is that when I criticise the left, I essentially deny that they are left-wing, whereas when I talk about the right-wing, the extreme right-wing, I don't do the same thing. Now, this is because I think that the woke skulls, social justice warriors, critical theorists, whatever you want to call them, violate the very definitions, the foundational philosophies and ideologies of the left wing in what they do. Whereas I don't think this is true of the extreme right. I think what they do is merely the extreme or endpoint expression of exactly the same thought that underpins conservatism. In other words, the left wing, the extreme left wing so-called, violates the very things that define the left wing, whereas the extreme right wing expresses the very things that make one conservative or right wing. And I'm going to try and explain my thinking here. As a basis, I am using Roger Scruton's Dictionary of Political Thought, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I strongly recommend getting a copy of this if you discuss politics at all on YouTube or indeed anywhere else. It's a basic teaching text used in colleges and universities here in the UK. Now, Scruton was, died a couple of years ago now, I think. Scruton was a conservative philosopher of politics, so hopefully that will allay any concerns that I'm using a biased source in any way. He defines conservatism, which I'm taking to be the most baseline expression of right-wing thought, in the following ways, and there are 9 of them, so it's going to take a bit longer than examining socialism. So 1, they are conservative and perhaps authoritarian in their doctrines concerning the nature of civil society, with an emphasis on custom, tradition, nationality and allegiance as social bonds. So if we take these to their extreme, then customs and traditions are seen as justifications in and of themselves. At the extreme point, there is a resistance to reform and change, an adherence to and an identity as a nationality, which perhaps some might think more benignly is expressed as patriotism. Here in Europe, we tend to be a bit shy of patriotism. And in its more extreme, nationalism, xenophobia, isolationism, and supremacy of the people in the homeland, and a lack of concern for other people. And allegiance, in its most extreme form, would express itself as love for dear leader or strong leaders. The way in which people are bound onto Trump is a good example of that. It doesn't seem to matter how he behaves, what he's done, how corrupt he is. Same thing here in the UK with Boris Johnson. There is an allegiance to the strong leader that overrides those bounds, or even a respect for the office, no matter who holds it and what they do. And that in that extreme expression, that shows itself in traditionalistic, authoritarian dictatorships of nationalists. Number 2. Theories of political obligation framed in terms of obedience, legitimacy and piety, rather than contract, consent and justice. So the left wing tends to see things in those latter ways, that there is a social contract, that if you hand over anything to someone, then that creates an obligation upon them, that there is a bargain between the two of you, that you must consent to the way in which you're being governed, even if it's not explicit, that it exists as a social contract, and that anyone in these positions of power is obligated to act in a just and fair fashion and to be held accountable otherwise. Whereas the right wing places its values, as was said here, in terms of obedience, legitimacy and piety, so that the obligation between the ruler and the ruled, you should expect obedience because you're the leader, because of the inherent authority of your office or because of your standing in tradition. So that might be a religious office, for example. So the Pope would be an example of an extreme form of political obligation. You are obligated to him because he is God's voice on earth, according to your religion. Now, this is how we see theocracies, which are seen as inherently right-wing and authoritarian, as we see in the Middle East and so on. So those are expressions. So dominionism, theocracy, these are extreme expressions of these underlying ideas. 3. Reluctance to countenance too great a divorce between law and morality, i.e. between the enactments of the state and the sentiments of society, and hence a resistance to liberalising reforms in the law. So this is the idea that the law is inherently right and just and moral because it is the law. It's a legalistic way of going about things, and or attempts to enforce moral judgments, particularly subjective moral judgments, via the law, e.g. by banning homosexuality, the drug war, things like that. Those are stronger expressions of these kind of underlying ideas. So again, we can see the adherence to tradition, the authoritarianism, the law and order sort of ideas here that in their extreme forms lead you to a police state of legally enforced bigotry. 4. Cultural conservatism. This depends on the society that you're in, but basically it's the idea that traditional values are inherently good because they are traditional, because they jibe with the morality of either an activated minority or the majority of the society, whereas in a more democratic and liberal society we do not enforce our cultural norms, and therefore they're more amenable to change. 5. Respect for the hereditary principle and prescriptive rights. A prescriptive right is one that is something that's just what you've done. No one has objected, it's gone on for a long time. So the classic example is a sort of right of way. If you have walked across someone else's property to get to your house or your workshop or whatever for a long time, and then that property changes ownership, you might be considered to still have a right of way simply because it's always been done that way. That's essentially the classic example of a prescriptive right. Now this one goes right the way back to the origins of the terms left wing and right wing, where the right wing were much more in support of the king and the nobility, and the left wing weren't. So this might express itself in a reverence for monarchy or for natural leadership, for dynasties, those sorts of things, for the continuance of property and wealth to be passed down in its entirety from father to son, for example. So in its extreme form, you see it in the form of dear leader, dynasties, dictatorships, the mandate of heaven, mandated by God, all of these sorts of ideas. So in their extreme forms, which you might find in sort of traditional monarchists or theocrats, that's just a further expression of this baseline idea. 6. Belief in private property, not as a natural right, but as an indispensable part of the condition of society. So in its extreme form, this would mean that nothing is held in the commons, that you have complete and absolute rights over anything you own, and you can own absolutely anything. So we see these ideas in their most extreme form expressed in objectivism or anarcho-capitalism or the stronger wing of economic libertarianism. That's where we see these ideas, where nothing is held in the commons and nothing should be held in the commons, and the idea that taxation is theft and so on. So this kind of ties in to their kind of absolute belief in individualism, even if they would benefit from a more collective approach, or the idea that society as a whole, which includes me, benefits from taxation and social investment. This is anathema to this view. Taken in its extreme point of view, you can see exactly where we find that idea expressed and how it ties into this. So it's just an extreme expression of that. 7. Belief in elementary freedoms and in the irreplaceable value of the individual as against the collective. This kind of ties into the previous point. You can see this as pathological selfishness in the same way that the left is often accused of pathological altruism. So they will allow 100 people to suffer for the sake of one person's rights, in inverted commas, going unviolated. You might see this in terms of gun rights in the United States, which combines a lot of these ideas. It's tradition. We've always done it this way. We shouldn't change it because of that. You know, my right to own and fire a gun is more important than 100 murder victims' right to live and exist. So that's where you might see that expressed. And this is where we do see a contradiction in conservatism, because a nation or a cultural norm is a collective, but at the same time they reject collectivism. So these are two aspects of conservatism that are in tension with each other. 8. Belief in free enterprise, free markets, and a capitalist economy is the only mode of production compatible with human freedom and suited to the temporary nature of human aspirations. So again, if we take this to an extreme, just as on the left, we would see an extreme in the form of Marxist socialism, where everything is held by the state, and later in communism, everything is held in the commons. Here we see everything being run for profit for the sake of free markets. This goes back to the individualism and the rights of ownership and the rejection of any kind of collectivism, and also ties into conservative views on human nature. So in its extreme form, again, we see this in objectivism or libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism. So it's pathological in the same way that the left wing is pathological about having everything owned by the state or whatever. Interestingly, through corporatization, through corporatism, we can see the state controlling everything in examples of right-wing extremism, like fascism. But that's it's a bit different. That's with corporations being brought into the fold, being incorporated into the nation as a sort of command position rather than being overtaken by the state. It's bringing money in, it's not taking it over. So there is an important difference there, even though it seems like a contradiction. But this is, in its extreme form, is an ideological stance where you privatize everything, even things where private enterprise doesn't make sense. But you can find people just as extreme on the other side. Healthcare is, again, a good example of this, in the US at least. Finally, 9. Varying degrees of belief in human imperfectibility and original sin. So the stereotype of the left-wing view, which I don't share, by the way, is that human beings are fundamentally good, and once you remove impediments and encouragement to act in bad and selfish ways, then they will be naturally altruistic. Whereas the conservatives tend to view people as innately evil, out for themselves, selfish, and that we must force them through threats and so on to be good people. So one is a fundamentally positive view of human nature, one is a fundamentally negative point of view on human nature. I think it's somewhere in between, but that's by the by. In its extreme form, we see this on the right wing as encouraging people to behave badly. So in something like objectivism, we see a philosophy that encourages and excuses extreme forms of selfishness, self-regard, disregard for others. Or we might see this expressed in terms of it being okay and good and right and correct to hate certain people, to be xenophobic, to be racist, to be Islamophobic, much as I hate the term. That's how we see this expressed. So hatred for the other, which we've often seen in history in fascist groups, in fascist governments, or we've seen more recently in the attempts to stoke fear or to excuse hate for certain outgroups in various political campaigns. So anyway, hopefully that explains why I treat these things differently. If we look at each of these values that are associated with or foundational to conservatism, and then we look at the far right, we see that all they're doing is expressing an extreme form of these baseline values. Whereas if we look at critical race theory, woke scold, social justice warriors, whatever you want to call them, what they do violates the definitional principles of left-wing thought in a way that the right-wing, the extreme right-wing, doesn't. And that's why I treat the two things differently. Zang.
The Atomic Age, with its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent. Agent of Swing.
Stereo noses.